This story occurred last summer around mid-June, when the weather was just starting to heat up. I had just come back from college on break, and was excited to see my long-distance girlfriend for the first time since spring break. To get a little privacy from our parents, we decided to drive into the mountains. I lived in a big city, so driving into the mountains was a nice way to get away. I took her to one of my favorite spots, a dark and desolate paved road that ran between two large mountains for 10 to 20 miles. The road is pitch black at night, with no houses and very few cars out. If you're lucky, you can even see some stars, which is unusual for where I live due to all the smog. As we drove, we passed cars parked in desolate turnouts, most likely doing you-know-what. But the further we went into the canyon, we saw less and less signs of life. We had been driving for about 10 minutes since last seeing another car, and decided to pull over at the next turnout to relax and stargaze. I pulled over and popped the trunk of my Subaru, grabbing a few pillows and blankets from the back seat and setting up a nice area for us to lay in the trunk. I had turned the engine off but left the keys in the ignition to keep the music on, as taking them out would completely turn my car off. I turned off my headlights and rolled down the driver's side window halfway. I've always been paranoid about locking myself out of the car, ever since getting locked out in a grocery store parking lot. I remember having to wait almost an hour for AAA to come get me back in the car, and that was in the city. I didn't want to think how long it would take for them to come get us in this remote area. Plus, there was no service anywhere for miles, so we wouldn't have been able to call for help anyway. I climbed into the trunk and cuddled up to my girlfriend. We talked while gazing up at the stars. I remember being surprised at how clear it was, the bright moon and stars lightly illuminating the surrounding area. We had been laying there for about 15 minutes when my girlfriend suddenly tensed. She sat up abruptly and looked like she was listening intently. "What's wrong?" I asked. She put a finger to her lips and continued listening. I listened carefully too, but could only hear the soft melody of the music. "I thought I heard footsteps," my girlfriend said softly. I listened for a few seconds before saying something I would regret for a long time. "It's probably nothing. We haven't heard a car since we got here." I sat up and gently pulled her back. We lay back down together in silence. I looked up at the skyline and watched a plane slowly pass in the distance. My girlfriend finally relaxed and curled up closer to me. That's when the music abruptly shut off. At first, I couldn't even process what had happened. My car never shuts off the music as long as the keys are in the ignition. I snapped out of my trance and quickly looked over the back seats at my dashboard. The computer was off. The usual displays showing the time and temperature were off too. Praying that my battery hadn't just died, I got up out of the trunk and walked over to the driver's side door. I opened the door and reached for the keys to start the car. However, as my hand got to the ignition, it felt nothing but air. My keys were not there. A mix of adrenaline and panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on, searching my car floor and the surrounding area. It didn't make sense. My keys could have never just fallen out of the ignition. Suddenly, I heard a quiet rustling in the bushes on the other side of the road. The puzzle pieces started to fall into place as I realized what might have happened. I rushed to get my girlfriend out of the trunk and told her to get in the car. I got in the driver's side door and slammed it shut and locked it, which I now realize was a stupid idea. I explained what I thought happened to my girlfriend. That noise she heard must have been someone sneaking up to the car, who likely reached through the half-open window and took the keys out of the ignition. It sounded insane coming from my mouth, but it was the only possible explanation. The whole time, I had my eyes fixated on the dark bushes across the road, but I couldn't turn on my headlights without the keys. We were talking about what to do next when we heard the click of the car unlocking. Whoever had my keys had pressed the unlock button. I relocked the car, sheer terror rushing through my body. The car unlocked again. Whoever had my keys was playing with us. My fight or flight senses kicked in, and I chose to run. I whispered, "We need to leave," and quickly got out of the car. We ran towards the back of the car and down a slight incline into the shrubs and bushes. We stopped after traveling around 50 feet to listen. I heard slight footsteps and then my car door open. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. Who was this person and what did they want? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. My girlfriend grabbed my hand and motioned that we should keep moving. We slowly descended the slope until we reached a flat covered area where we stopped to rest. Luckily, my girlfriend's GPS worked, and it showed we were close to a road. She led us there, where we used her phone's satellite SOS feature to contact emergency services. A patrol car showed up shortly after, where we explained the whole thing. To my immense relief, my Subaru was still there, parked exactly where we had left it. The officer got out and checked out the nearby bushes. When it was safe to come out, I walked over to see the window half open in the same position. I looked inside and found my keys sitting in the ignition, as if none of this had even happened. The officer took our report and escorted us down the mountain. The only thing that had been stolen was a 50 that I left in the center console. I still am unsure about what really happened that night. Where did whoever stole my keys come from? There were no other cars around for miles. I sometimes think I imagined the whole thing, as it's easier to cope that way. This story happened many years ago to my father. He has only told me this story once, and has refused to talk about it more since. When my father was younger, either a freshman or sophomore in college, he and his friends used to go out partying on the weekends after a long week of classes. His friend, Ryan, the usual ringleader of the group, had had a couple of beers and suggested they visit a local cemetery that was maybe a 15-minute drive away. His friend Todd was a film major and loved pretty much anything horror-related, and immediately agreed. Being pressured by the two, combined with the couple of beers he had had, my father agreed. Soon enough, the trio found themselves driving down the dark roads away from campus. Drinking and driving is incredibly dangerous, and something my father's heavily against now, but at the time they were young and stupid. Shortly after, Ryan slowed the car down and searched for a quiet place to park. They had to find somewhere out of line of sight of the main road, as police have been known to patrol the area sometimes. Finding a spot, the group got out and hopped the shortest fence into the graveyard. My father described the graveyard as vast, eerie, and overgrown. The tombstones were covered in moss and cracked from years of neglect. There was an oppressive silence, the kind that makes you acutely aware of every rustling leaf and distant owl hoot. They walked further into the graveyard, their laughter gradually fading as the reality of where they were set in. Ryan reached into his backpack, where he had packed a few beers, but both my father and Todd cautioned him against it. Todd led the way, flashlight in hand, occasionally swinging it towards something interesting like a grave or monument. After about 10 minutes of wandering, they stumbled upon an old, decrepit mausoleum. It stood out, as it had been the only building the group had seen while exploring. Its Gothic architecture and iron door gave it an incredibly creepy look, especially since it was only be illuminated in the dark by Todd's flashlight. Ryan, who was already bored from starting to sober up, suggested they go inside. Todd agreed, but my father hesitated. He felt a growing sense of unease, a gnawing feeling in his gut telling him to turn back. But not wanting to appear scared, he followed his friends. Surprisingly, it was unlocked. The iron door creaked loudly as they pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty graveyard. Inside, it was even darker, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rows of old, dust-covered coffins. Todd whispered something about how great the setting would be for a movie. The trio slowly walked further inside the building. The mausoleum was surprisingly large inside, despite its small and unassuming exterior. Ryan lowered his flashlight to read one of the tombstones when it happened. A faint scratching sound rang out from the far end of the room. My father froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Ryan shone his flashlight towards the source of the noise, but a large coffin in the middle blocked their view. "Maybe it's just a rat," Todd whispered, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. As they slowly moved closer to the coffin, the scratching happened again. This time, it was accompanied by a low, incoherent whispering. Someone or something was hiding behind that large coffin. Non-verbally, they decided it was time to leave. Slowly, the trio backed out of the mausoleum, with Todd's flashlight fixated on the coffin in the middle. When the glow from the flashlight had almost completely dispersed from distance, a figure emerged from behind the coffin. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it came closer to the flashlight's glow, they could see it was an old man. My father described the man as almost lifeless, wearing a black cloak with dark pants. He was skinny with a crazed look in his eye. He raised a bony finger and pointed at them, his mouth moving as if chanting something, but no sound came out. Todd turned and sprinted, leaving the man in total darkness. My father and Ryan followed suit, running back the way they came and up and over the fence back to the car. They sped back to campus in silence. None of them spoke a word about what had happened, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the safety of the dorms, they made a pact to never speak of that night again. I'm going to tell you the story of the only time I truly feared for my life. I've been an avid hiker for many years, as my father and I used to frequently visit the California national parks. I know it's dangerous, but I love to hike alone. There's something about being able to get away from the hustle and bustle of daily life and clear your head in nature. Having hiked alone many times with no issues, I expected the same from the hour-long climb to the top of Mount Cobb, where I was going to watch the sunset. It was winter at the time, so the sun set around 5:30. I started the hike around 4, bringing a small backpack to carry some gear. My father always drilled the importance of protecting myself against wildlife. It is black bear country, so I brought a container of bear spray just in case. I also brought a small pocket knife, a small handheld radio, and a flashlight, fully expecting to finish the hike in the dark after I watched the sunset. I got to the top with no issues and sat down to watch the sunset on a rock that overlooked a valley of dense forest. I noticed a man sitting on another rock a few hundred feet away, staring off into the distant sunset. He seemed like the average hiker, but I thought it was strange that he had no backpack or any gear with him. I shrugged it off until I noticed him turn and look at me with a blank expression. I smiled and nodded to him, only for him to slowly turn back towards the valley with the same blank expression. Feeling uncomfortable, I got up and continued a little ways up the trail until I was out of sight of the man. I watched the last of the sunset and started my descent, wanting to conserve the little daylight I had left before total darkness. I passed the spot where I saw the man earlier to find it empty. I was relieved, thinking that he had most likely already left. Just 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and my heart sank into my stomach. The same man stood 50 feet back, quickly walking down the trail towards me. How on earth did this guy get behind me? This trail was relatively open, so a person would have had to deliberately hide or walk deep into the tree line to not be seen. Both possibilities unsettled me. I decided to stop and move to the side and let him pass, pretending to look at my phone, only for the man to now stop too. I started to walk again down the trail, shortly followed by the noise of the man continuing too. More minutes passed of the same, with the day slowly fading into darkness. I was truly freaked out by the thought of having to navigate the trail in the dark while being followed by this guy. I decided to try and stop one more time to let this man pass. This time, however, instead of stopping, the man charged. He looked deranged, with his hands flailing about his sides, racing towards me with speed. Terror coursing through me, I ran off the trail and towards the tree line. I didn't look back as I ran through the trees, but I could hear footsteps behind me. Thankfully, I was faster than him, and the daylight was nearly all gone. With an increased distance between me and the man, and darkness blocking his vision, I stopped behind a large tree, awkwardly slamming my backpack against it in an attempt to hide. I could hear leaves crunching on the other side of the tree, as if the man was pacing. I held my breath, trying to be as silent as possible. One long minute later, I started to hear footsteps move in the opposite direction. I breathed a sigh of relief and waited for a while before reaching into my backpack to grab my flashlight. As I was getting ready to walk back towards the trail, something shattered the silence. My radio went off, emitting a low frequency that would have been audible for miles. Not wanting to stick around with my location revealed, I booked it back towards the trail, sprinting down the mountain using only the light from my flashlight. I didn't even stop to listen or look behind me as I ran. I finally reached the car and threw the ignition, hightailing it out of sight of the trail. There was something so surreal about what I just experienced that I burst into laughter as I drove, likely a coping method my brain was using. Looking back on it now, I think when I bumped into the tree, it switched the radio on. However, catching a random frequency at that very moment was incredibly unlucky. This is still the scariest experience of my life, and I am very fortunate to have been able to navigate the trail in the dark so fast.